Hello and welcome to On Second Thought, a bonus series from And the Runner-Up Is. On April 10th, 2019, I released the episode of And the Runner-Up Is on the 1969 Best Picture race, where we discussed Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid as the likely runner-up that lost Best Picture to Midnight Cowboy. But on second thought, what if the runner-up was really Zed?
Ils savent que je...
Bien sûr, madame. Et ça ne fait que commencer.
Hello, and welcome back to On Second Thought, where we discuss another Best Picture nominee that we did not cover as the runner-up on the main show for the Best Picture series, and discuss whether it may have actually been the runner-up. I'm your host, Kevin Jacobson, and we are revisiting 1969 today. And on the main show, I said that Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid was the runner-up to Midnight Cowboy, but today we are discussing if it actually could have been another film, Z, or as they pronounced it in the film, Zed. And my guest today has been heard on a huge number of episodes of this show at this point. Lots of bonus episodes, a few main show episodes too. Recently, you heard him covering the most recent Oscar race, which was us covering The Father as a potential Best Picture runner-up to Nomadland. That was a lot of fun. Please welcome back to the show from Next Best Picture, Josh Parham.
Hello, thank you so much for having me back. I am very much looking forward to this conversation.
Good, excellent. And also just wanted to, I guess, announce here that from here on out, I'm only having one guest on my On Second Thought episodes. Traditionally, I've had two, but let's just say it can be a big hassle with coordinating schedules and such. And I personally love just having one-on-one conversations with people that I figured now that we're in a new decade here with 1969, a new era, I'll just make that shift now and hopefully people won't mind too much. So,
yeah, it should be fun.
Yeah. All right, shall we jump in?
Let's.
Okay. Well, Z, or Zed, is an Algerian French political thriller that is somewhat based on the killing of the Greek politician Grigory Lambrakis in 1963. And all the names are changed for the film, but it's based on a novel that is essentially based on a real story, which involves the pacifist faction, the leftists in Greece. They are gathering for a speech that is in favor of nuclear disarmament, and the state officials and the military police are trying to combat this insurgence that's gradually been building up, and it comes to a head when the deputy of the pacifist group is murdered, and this causes all kinds of grief from all sides, really. The government's really trying to control the narrative, and there's this examining magistrate who's trying to get to the bottom of what happened, and it's just a whole tangled web of cover-ups and political intrigue and such. We'll maybe get into more details as we're discussing it, but that's the gist. The film was directed by Costa-Gavras, who co-wrote the screenplay with Jorge Sempron, and it stars Jean-Louis Trintignant as the examining magistrate, Yves Montand, Irene Papas, Jacques Perrine, and a whole host of others. It's a big ensemble film. And this film made $14 million at the box office. It was one of the bigger hits of the year in the U.S., relatively speaking. It was in the top 15, so I'd say that's a hit, especially for a non-English language film. And it was nominated for 5 Oscars, winning 2, but not Best Picture. So, Josh, actually, first question is, had you seen this film before? And then also, what are your overall thoughts?
I had seen this film before, but it had been many years ago, probably close to a decade,
okay.
honestly. So it had been a very long time. But I remember liking it, but again, so much time had passed that I remembered some of it, but not the whole thing. So revisiting it for our conversation was really influential and very necessary. And I really liked this movie. Like it's really really good. The one thing that I have against it, there's only one particular element that I think is not the strongest, and it's that you did mention that there are so many characters in this movie. And I think
Yes.
as a result of that, you don't really get to know many of them.
Mm.
There is some like backstory given to characters here, and there's some shading, but for the most part, they're like kind of working with archetypes. They're not really very like well defined characters in this film, and I think that's the one thing that I am missing from it a bit. But having said that, this is still like a really intriguing like procedural that they have going on here, and I'm so fascinated with the process of like discovering all this information and the investigation that is happening and how all sides are really involved in it, both the people trying to solve it and those that are actively impeding this investigation. And I find all of that to be so fascinating to watch. And, thematically speaking, this movie's over 50 years old and kind of chilling how some of
Mm.
it still seems very relevant today and maybe ways that I maybe think the filmmakers themselves had hoped would not be relevant, unfortunately.
Oh
But
yeah.
that always just makes it even more interesting. So, yeah, I think that this is a pretty incredible piece of filmmaking, and I really do love this movie.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I agree. This is a fascinating movie. It is a very chilling, prescient movie. I agree. I'd actually seen this before when I was doing the Best Picture series for the first time. And I remember really liking it and finding it very striking and raw and really depicting some of those, harsh truths about society and governments. But for some reason, I couldn't really remember that much of the details.
Mm.
So going into this rewatch, it really felt like, again, kind of like you, I sort of had some fresh eyes on it. And yeah, this really packs a punch. This is such a striking film, especially in what it's saying about, totalitarianism and just what happens when people rise up and the cover-ups that go down. But then also, really, like, as a piece of filmmaking, this is pretty impeccably crafted. Like, there's such a strong attention to detail, and it's doing its best to recreate the atmosphere out on the streets and just the tension in the air and, all of the uncertainty of this political unrest in the 60s. It's not an American story, but I think you can see why people in America and other countries from all over the world really would resonate with this story, because it is sadly quite universal. And yeah, it's still to a certain extent the kind of problems that a lot of countries are still facing today. And yeah, I feel like the techniques, just the filmmaking techniques that are used here, have that universality too, like the quick editing and the cinematography, which is so gritty that, and raw. And then also, yes, the archetypes I think are very familiar feeling, at least, with like the magistrate who's like this detective who's trying to crack the case kind of thing. And you have all the witnesses and then the perps who are kind of like bumbling and such. And then the government officials who are very strict and they're just looking out for themselves. And yeah, so I mean, obviously this is a very specific story, but I don't know if this is how you felt too, but it's almost like the specifics aren't as important in the overall takeaway of the film so much as just the big picture message about how all these different factions are going up against each other and they clash. And it resonates for me, at least, more on that kind of symbolic level, more so than the specifics of this story.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the movie even starts by saying like any similarities are not a coincidence, sort of like a
Yes.
twist on the usual disclaimer that movies have. And I think it really sets out to show the audience that this story should resonate with any group of people, with any country and any nation, because it is sadly that tension between an authoritarian government clashing with the local opposition and how it is so difficult to get any kind of justice within that. Even when people are trying their best to do good, like this prosecutor is, he's so pragmatic in every decision he makes. You even get frustrated with him, and he's supposed to be somewhat
Yeah.
of the good guy of this story, but it shows you all of those frustrations that this kind of government will constantly indulge in, and that is something that just seems to be ever present. It's never going away, it seems. Every attempt to fight it always seems like you're going to have some futile resolutions to it. But
Mm.
as sad as that is, it does mean that the story remains relevant. And yeah, seeing it over 50 years later, it still has so much power in all of these procedures that are happening.
Oh, absolutely. And, also one other thing that I was thinking about is just how direct the message is here, the political message. I mean, well, as we know, like filmmakers have been making political films since almost the beginning of film, but especially in the 60s, there was this emergence of the kind of dangerous, on the streets, gritty filmmaking, ready to make a statement. And I mean, as you said, the disclaimer is saying like the events are not coincidental, it's intentional. And I would say that a film like this either directly or indirectly leads to the kind of success that Oliver Stone would have with
Yeah.
his political films. And, to use a modern example, someone like Adam McKay, who, regardless of your feelings on how good his films are, he's trying to at least make a direct point about a political issue or a societal issue that's very in your face. It's not hidden, it's not coded. I mean, I do think people like Oliver Stone and Adam McKay are probably more blunt in their styles than this is for sure. But, it feels like you can sort of draw a line between this film and what he's doing here to what a lot of these politically minded directors are doing, or at least trying to do in this era. I mean, I actually even see a little bit of like Argo too with Ben
Yeah.
Affleck and the kind of gritty, dizzying feeling on the streets style. Like this really feels like such an influential film.
Oh yeah. Man, we can't get away from Oliver Stone in our conversations.
No, I know. I know.
He keeps coming up.
Yeah.
But yeah, I definitely can see that kind of a comparison. And what's also interesting is that this movie does definitely have that raw grittiness feel to it, but I also feel like the movie does have a sense of control in it too. And you get
Yeah.
that in the cinematography in some sequences. Like I think there are times where the camera is very fluid but also feels controlled in its direction. But at the same time, it's also the editing of this movie, which, it's Oscar winning editing. And the
Mm-hmm.
way that it also feels so controlled but experimental at the same time, the way that it goes back and forth between certain time periods to make these emotional connections, like that is something that feels very unique and kind of ahead of its time. Even like you said, the whole Adam McKay editing style is very familiar to us now, unfortunately,
Mm-hmm.
but I would say that it is much better here, yes. And the way
Oh
that it
yeah.
connects all of its characters and these plot points in a way that is not linear but is never completely disorienting is like incredible to witness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it does a great job even from the beginning of just laying the groundwork for what the situation is at this time in Greece, and the way that, the government official in the beginning is talking in his speech about um, ideological mildew, and talking about isms and the sort of moral rot of leftism and all the kind of classic rhetoric that, right wing leaders have used for generations at this point. And then, you have the pacifist group, and they're trying to find a way to work within these obstacles that have been put in place by the government. You have, the military, how they're sort of in cahoots with the government, and the press is being swayed in one direction or another, and it's the protesters and the counter protesters. So I think obviously there's a lot going on and it can be kind of dizzying, but I think he does set the table really well to just show you how all of this tension and the collusion and all these different factions come to a head that leads to this incident that happens where the deputy is struck in the head. So I think that's just really well done in terms of pacing and just having all these different elements come together in this one sort of tragic moment that's going to influence the rest of the film. I think that's probably my favorite well executed part of this film for me, more so than what comes after.
Yeah, and once again, it's making a decision to kind of focus on that big picture element of this story,
Right.
and like it really is still obsessed with the details. Like the details are still definitely there, but it is more so concerned with how they all add up to a commentary about the political nature of the world around us. And I do admit that like I'm somebody that still really likes character work in movies. Like I
Yeah.
love character studies, and obviously this is not meant to be that. It doesn't have any ambitions to be that, but it does sacrifice some of those character details, and it is more of these people moving through this story to comment on those larger themes. And there is a small part of me that misses that a little bit, just because for me personally I tend to like those kinds of elements in movies, but it's obviously not the objective of the storytelling here. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that what it is trying to accomplish of showing this larger political kind of machine that's happening and what the consequences are of its operation is still incredibly intriguing. And that is definitely fascinating to watch, even if it does mean that the kind of more smaller minutia of the characters does go by the wayside.
Yeah, I agree. It can definitely feel more like these characters are sort of chess pieces
Yeah.
and archetypes more so than real human beings. And it does really just throw so many characters at you that honestly, I don't know if I'm just dumb, but it can be hard to keep up with who's who,
Yeah, I had that
especially if you're
issue as
not
well.
familiar with most of these actors or any of these actors.
And a lot of them don't have names either.
Right. They don't even like repeat each other's names ever that much. And you don't always even remember who's on which side. And you could say that maybe that's almost an intentional choice on his part, but it can definitely be disorienting and a little bit distracting from the overall message when you have to really feel like you're putting in the work to remember exactly like pinpointing who's who and how they fit into the overall fabric of everything, because it's a lot of white men in rooms talking about other white men and some of them with similar names even, so it's a lot.
Yeah, that can get, as you said, rather overwhelming with the amount of characters and how much you have to track. I do think at a certain point you do kind of acclimate to it a little bit,
Yeah.
and you get the broad strokes of who these characters are supposed to be, and knowing how they're supposed to comment on this larger thematic commentary, I think is also something that you recognize pretty quickly. And then it's like, okay, I sort of get what you're going for with these characters, but there are several times where it is like, okay, wait a minute, like which the colonel, the general, like who is he supposed to be? How far up the chain is he in this operation? Like how much did he actually know? And as you said, also like that could be somewhat of the point, that it is a very
Yeah.
complex web that they're weaving and you don't really know all the time. But in the moment, it can be a little frustrating to try to track all of these dots, and it can occasionally distract from your investment in the overall story.
Right, exactly. So even if I don't always find myself attached to the characters themselves, I do still think that the script is excellent, especially in these moments that I didn't even remember from my first watch, where it's peppering in all these references to the situation here and how, like, we have the driver who says he can't make his monthly payments to pay for a new muffler, or like when there's a reference to the hospital being underfunded, and this mention of how there's so much money that's been allocated to the military compared to any other part of helping people on the ground. It's these we I think we really get a sense for what this group is fighting for, and even when we're not getting the direct speeches and everything like that, it's like you still get a sense of the effects of the decisions that are being made by the government, and also just showing the extent to where they're trying to cover their own asses and prevent other countries from realizing the extent of this unrest that's happening. And it's all the stuff with the logistics where they say that, like, they've been tailing the leftists for their own safety and things like that. And how I think it's like the newspaper that's covering the whole incident with this very specific phrasing of how like the nature of the speech being anti-national is what led to the unrest, and then all the stuff that the prosecutor has to deal with, where the government officials are doing everything to just drive the narrative and just even put pressure on him and almost threaten his job. I just think there's so much rich detail, even in the middle of this political film that is very direct in what it's trying to say. It's still showing you more so than relying on people like yelling in your face about it.
Yeah, it shows you like the complexities that are still sort of in this world. And yeah, at the beginning when they mention how we're a democracy, we're going to let these people have their speech, because we wouldn't deny that. That's not how free societies work. But you then see that they basically bribe and intimidate all their venues to not allow them, and they set them up to be in the smaller settings so that they can control it more. So it's like it shows you right then and there like what they say and what they actually do, and show you that dichotomy that exists. I also really love when they do talk about how that the one driver can't make his payments for his car, or there's another conversation with one of the criminals about how, if he gets sick, he's got to go to work regardless. But if a rich man gets sick, he can take a week off. And even that shows you that even the forces that are pro for this government, that are on its side, understands the inequalities that are happening. They understand what the opposition is supposedly fighting for, but even them, they are so engulfed in the propaganda of the government that even though they would probably agree with most of the positions that the opposition is advocating for, they are still against them just due to the very nature of how controlling this society is. And that is something that doesn't have to be explicitly stated, but is just mentioned, and then you understand it within the fabric of the rest of the world that has been created in this film.
Thank you for listening to this preview of On Second Thought, a bonus series from And the Runner-Up Is. If you liked what you heard and want to hear more, please go to patreon.com/andtherunnerup.is and become a patron. Only $3 a month will get you access to bonus episodes, a Slack channel, and early access to regular episodes. Thank you so much for your consideration.